Good morning. My name is Matthew R. Kearns, and I serve as the Associate Director of Member and Alumni Relations for Focus St. Louis. Focus St. Louis is a nonprofit organization. Our mission is to educate leaders, connect leaders, and facilitate important conversations for St. Louis and the surrounding region. Today is our 7th sneak peek into our new series, Focus, Elevate Leadership, a continuing education program designed to fulfill our purpose of continuing to inspire and equip leaders. These professional development courses will immerse participants in breakthrough thinking in order to grow their confidence, knowledge, and networks. Today's topic, productive conflict in the workplace. Our guest, Aaron Van Groningen. Aaron is a senior organizational development and training consultant for Carter Hicks LLC, with over 10 years of experience in research psychology. Aaron seeks to utilize a research-based approach to improve individual and organizational functioning. He has worked with clients in a variety of industries to provide services covering a wide array of topics such as leadership, change management, organizational learning, training and development, productive conflict, diversity and inclusion, and more. By taking a scientific approach and applying it to real-world situations, Aaron seeks to provide clients with knowledge, skills, and abilities they need to achieve their vision and mission. Aaron will deliver content today for the first part of this presentation, and he'll take questions following via the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen. Aaron will try to make it to everyone's question, but if he is unable to answer your question, you can email me, Matthew K, at focus-stl.org, and I will talk with him and reply with your answer. Please turn all microphones off. Focus St. Louis would like to thank lead sponsor Citi and presenting sponsor Daugherty Business Solutions for this opportunity. And now, please welcome Aaron Van Groningen.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Matthew. I got to say, I've done a couple of these webinars, and that was probably the nicest introduction I've had on this entire quarantine, so thank you. Like Matthew said, my name is Aaron Van Groningen. I'm a senior organizational development and training consultant for Carter Hicks. We specialize kind of in the areas, as you mentioned, of organizational development, training, and diversity inclusion. And we're excited to be a part of the Elevate Leadership Series. We've been fortunate enough to partner with Focus St. Louis for a number of years now, specifically with the Impact Fellows Program. So I'm excited to kind of dive into something a little bit different with the Elevate Leadership Series and bring you hopefully a new tool that'll be useful. I'm going to talk about everyone's favorite topic. My boss likes to joke that the reason I cover this is because I drew the short straw when I started at the company. But that's not true. I absolutely love the idea of conflict. That sounds pretty bad when you hear it, first of all. But I think a lot of organizations don't utilize conflict to its full ability. And for most people, probably yourself, when you first saw this webinar, when you first saw the flyer for Elevate Leadership Series, and you saw that conflict was one of the topics covered, you probably immediately had a certain mental picture in your mind, right? For a lot of people, that's that knockdown, drag out kind of fighting, backstabbing, vindictive, personality-driven conflict that we've come to expect from reality TV. I know that it's entertaining to watch during this quarantine. My wife and I have watched a lot of reality TV, a lot of below deck here in my house. So we're familiar with how entertaining that kind of idea of conflict is when you're watching it from afar. But if you've ever been a person that's involved in conflict or even been around conflict, you can attest to how draining it is, just what a negative impact it has. Not to mention when it comes to your workplace, when there's a whole bunch of other considerations going on. Researchers have said that conflict is one of the biggest reducible costs that an organization will face. In entrepreneur.com, I believe it was last year, they estimated that organizations globally would lose over $1 billion total because of unproductive conflict that was unaddressed. So our goal here is to help people to think more effectively about it and to try to avoid some of those pitfalls. Looking at it in the micro, if you just think about yourself, conflict within your workplace, it can reduce your motivation for getting work done. You have poor quality relationships with those you work with. You tend to perform poorly, and you have lower levels of work and life satisfaction. So because of all this kind of negative association with conflict, What a lot of organizations do is they kind of go the other way completely with it. They say, we've seen all the negative, nasty side of conflict. Let's just not engage in conflict and we won't deal with this issue at all. We won't lose a bunch of money. We won't, have all a bunch of these negative individual impacts, and we'll just keep operating without any conflict. Well, the funny thing is that conflict is completely inevitable, right? Anytime you have people interacting with one another, conflict is bound to occur. If you have conflict with your friends and family, those are people you care about, you choose to spend time with, people that you maybe share a blood relation with. How much more likely are you going to have conflict with someone who happens to work with you that probably has a different background, different experiences, different thoughts? It's just a natural thing that's going to occur. And for a lot of organizations, when we go in, they may say, well, we have problems over here in this area. And when we do our data collection, when we do root cause analysis, what we'll find out is that, well, they have unresolved conflict over here because they said, we don't engage in conflict, we're not going to allow it to occur. But they still have these issues that pop up. It's like trying to stuff a bunch of stuff into a trash bag. You can keep stuffing, and it'll hold for a while. But when it finally does break, you're going to have a bigger mess than what you started out with. And that's true of conflict. If you keep trying to sweep it under the rug, you're going to get problems much bigger than you would have had originally. So we can see that negatively impact functioning. And Patrick Lencioni, in his book, The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, describes this as artificial harmony, where a team is just trying to get along, they avoid conflict at all costs. And not only will that probably bubble up somewhere else, but he kind of talks about that idea of groupthink and the example of the Challenger space shuttle as an example of why artificial harmony is dangerous. Most of you are probably familiar with the story. It's famously taught in social psychology courses. It's the idea that there was a group of individuals, engineers, tasked with making sure that the shuttle was safe to launch, that everything was a-okay. But for some reason, the group was unable or unwilling to engage in conflict, to share that different opinions, the different ideas. And as a result, it led to this horrible tragedy. Now, that of course is an extreme example, but I think the concepts are still the same there. If we're not having this passionate debate about ideas, if I'm not challenging the status quo, the organization will remain stagnant. One of the things as working as a consultant that we've seen time and time again, and we tell our clients, is that in an organization, everything works until all of a sudden it doesn't, until you find yourself behind the times, not on the cutting edge of things. So engaging in conflict, as long as it's the right kind of conflict, will help the organization succeed in the future. So our goal for the session in November is to really help us understand what's that middle ground here. We have artificial harmony on one hand, and we have the reality TV version of conflict on the other hand. And how can we get ourselves to the middle where we're engaging in conflict, we're sharing ideas, having different opinions, without tripping over into the side where we're having personal attacks, where we're vindictive, fighting, digging our heels in. And I just wanted today, in today's webinar, just give a little bit of an insight about what we'll be covering fully for the session in November. Now, in order to help us, this is not a conflict management or conflict resolution tools. I think those are beneficial and they have their place. But if those are the only skills you have, that's all you're going to be able to utilize in the workplace. If all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So if all you have is conflict management or conflict resolution tools, you're probably not going to allow your organization to engage in productive conflict. This idea where we can share opinions, share debates, where it might get, passionate, it might have a spirited nature to it, but we're still being respectful of one another, and we keep the ideas focused on the work itself and not on the personal attacks of individuals. So to help do that, the actual session in November will utilize Everything DISC's productive conflict. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the idea of familiar with DISC. It's kind of well known. It's not a measure of personality, it's a measure of behavioral styles. And the actual session itself in November will go through 3 different modules. The first module, which we'll be covering today in a little bit, we'll just be scratching the surface really. It's about helping us better understand ourselves as well as understanding others in conflict. Because a lot of times when we're in conflict, we view ourselves as kind of the objective third party. We're just simply stating facts, we're just simply being the normal logical ones, and everyone else is having, that kind of freak out meltdown, whatever it may be. But in actuality, that's not the case, right? If we actually critically think about ourselves in conflict, we a lot of times contribute to that. We a lot of times engage in behaviors, our ways of thinking are maladaptive for the situation, which leads to these unproductive responses. So the first module is about understanding ourselves, but also understanding other people's reactions to conflict. If I understand what they're coming from, if I understand what's important to them, what they fear, what their tendencies are, I can adapt my style to be more effective so that I can engage in a healthier, more productive conflict. So that's the first module. And modules 2 and 3 are all about how do we take this information and how do we actually change how we behave in the workplace? How do we change our thoughts? How do we handle our emotions? How do we change our behaviors when we're actually faced with conflict? So we'll be covering module 1, and I think module 1 is probably a good place for us to start, especially considering where we are as a country and as a workforce. We're facing a bunch of issues right now. There's a bunch of stress. I think everyone's emotions are running pretty high right now, especially when you kind of look at this pandemic. The majority of us are now working remotely. We're doing all our meetings on Zoom. And in talking with Matthew kind of about this session, he was telling me about how he's heard from friends about Zoom brawls going on, about people really kind of not holding back anything. I've experienced that with clients, with fellow coworkers, where everyone seems a little bit more on edge, a little bit more willing to engage in conflict. So helping us understand conflict is a little bit more important now more than ever. When I'm on a Zoom call, I have everyone's pictures right in front of me. I can see every single facial expression they make. I can see every eye roll. I can see every smirk. I can see every frown. So I'm a lot more in tune to when people might disagree with me, and that lets my imagination run wild, right? I can say, well, they rolled their eyes, or their camera glitched out there for a little bit, or they turned it off right after I said this. They're not happy with me. So it kind of sets the stage for more conflict. Plus, we're having a lot fewer informal interactions. If I'm working in the office and the meeting didn't go well, I feel like there was some tension, I can go to that person afterwards and slyly just kind of see where they're at. I'm not getting that nowadays. We already have so many Zoom calls going on. I'm sure everyone on the webinar can attest to that you don't want to set another webinar or another Zoom chat just to have these kind of discussions, right? So instead we let things kind of slide and we let them simmer. Plus, what's interesting is that where we find ourselves now is what's referred to as a weak situation. As Matthew said, I'm a psychologist by trade, and one of my research areas is the intersection of personality in the workplace. And there's this idea, fundamental concept of how our personality is displayed called strong situation and a weak situation. It's kind of hard to describe, and the best example I heard from a professor a while ago is that if you think about a funeral, you have a bunch of different people there with a bunch of different personalities, yet everyone's behavior kind of falls within a narrow window of what's acceptable, right? And it's because of our societal pressures, kind of expectations put in place create a very strong situation of what's acceptable. And people who deviate from that kind of get a little bit of pushback. So it kind of forces everyone's behaviors into a very narrow window. Now, take that and compare it to a wild party. If you've ever been to a wild party, I'm sure in undergrad, I can't see anyone's faces right now, so I can't tell if people are smirking or trying to hide the fact that they were at these wild parties. But there's a lot less expectations. There's a lot less of a norm, a lot fewer pressures. So you can see a much wider swath of people's personalities on display. There's some people who are out there yelling, shouting, talking to everyone. There's people who are like holding up a wall the entire night. There's people who are messy, loud, all these different things. That's called a weak situation. Now, when you're in the workplace, that's kind of a strong situation because there's expectations, decorum, there's potential punishments if you don't kind of fall in line with what's expected of you. But now that we're all working remotely, most of us are working from home, we have to deal with childcare, we probably have a spouse here, we have to take care of the house and all these sorts of things. That creates a real weak situation. So we see a lot more strong displays of conflict that we may not have seen before. So I say all of this to say that I think now, and of course I would say this because I'm giving the webinar on conflict, But I think now more than ever, it's important for us to be aware of our own styles in conflict, our own approach to it, and try to move ourselves to a more productive tendency. So with all that being said, I want to walk through some of the aspects that you'll be seeing in November and hopefully give you a little bit of information that will be useful for you now and hold you over till we get to November. So I'm going to share my screen and pull up my PowerPoint there. So hopefully everyone can see that. So I would encourage you right now, if you can, this is probably the only time you'll hear this in a webinar. If you can, go ahead and take a screenshot of this right here. I think this is a useful tool. This is just kind of a general description of the 4 basic styles within the DISC framework here. So you have 4 different styles, and there's a bunch of different adjectives that kind of describe these individuals. You have the dominant individual who's direct, tough-minded, strong-willed, forceful. The I person influence, outgoing, enthusiastic, optimistic, steadiness, even-tempered, accommodating, patient, and conscientious, analytical, reserved, precise. So these are just some adjectives that help describe them. And I would encourage you now in looking at this, maybe try to self-diagnose a little bit. Maybe try to figure out exactly what your style is here. Now, when we actually do the session in November, everyone will have taken their assessment ahead of time, and you'll have a personalized report that details exactly what style you are. But since obviously we can't do that for the webinar, we have to wait until November. I think you can do a little bit of self-diagnosis here. And what's really interesting here is to look at the bottom of each of these descriptions. In conflict, what do these individuals focus on? So for that D individual, they focus on logic and victory in conflict. They want to make sure the ideas, the differing ideas being presented, make sense, but they also want to win the argument. The I individual, they want to make sure that they can express themselves, that they're heard, they're understood, that they're seen, and that they're valued. And also that everyone's feelings are taken into consideration, kind of that emotional aspect of conflict. The steadiness style, it shares the same idea of making sure everyone's feelings are attended to that you see with the I style, but they also want to make sure there's consensus. They don't want a single party to win or anything. They want a mutually agreeable solution for everyone. And conscientiousness, finally, that individual is focused on logic. They want to make sure it's objective, that the idea makes sense, it holds water. And they want justice. They don't care who wins. They don't care if it's a mutually agreeable solution. They just want the best idea possible moving forward. So this is very basic. We'll cover this a lot more in depth in the actual session on November. But I think if you can look through here and get a general idea, understanding of where you may fall, you can utilize some of this information and some of the information we'll touch on here in a few minutes to help you have more productive conflict. So in moving on, in the actual report, everyone will get a readout of what their DISC style is. So you can see the sample report I have here. Don't worry, this is truly a sample report. I'm not violating anyone's privacy or anything. But what I have here is the person's DISC style, and then there's a corresponding model that gives us a little bit more information. So this person's style is a D, and this is maybe what an example of someone's personalized report, what their model will look like. So there's a bunch going on here that I want to touch on. The first thing you may notice is the shading. The shading just corresponds to how the person answered the questions in the assessment. I think there's something between 20 or 30 items in the assessment. And what you'll notice is this person, although they're a D, they have shading in every single kind of quadrant there. So that just highlights that each person is not just a single style, but they're made up of an amalgamation of all different styles with one that's usually a little bit more pronounced. So the other thing you may notice is that there are 8 different words kind of written around the outside of the model there. And these represent different priorities that an individual possesses during conflict. So a person can have anywhere from 3 to 5 of these. So, and you'll notice that this person here, the sample report, they value assertion, control, justification, and objectivity. And they correspond with the shading. And this hash shading just means that this person has a priority or value that's not typical of someone with their DISC style. So hopefully at this point, you've kind of diagnosed yourself whether you might be a D, I, S, or C. And what I'd like to do now is to read through some of the descriptions of these different priorities or values. Because while it's nice to know those adjectives, I think this is one of the biggest benefits of this session is diving in and figuring out exactly what are the priorities or values that are driving the way I think about conflict, the way I react to conflict, and just how I deal with conflict in general. So in just kind of reading these things quickly, I'd maybe ask you to pay attention to what disc style you think you're at, and just maybe make a note of what your priorities or values may be. So I'll start at the very top and kind of work my way clockwise just to make sure I cover everyone's information. So assertion, that's all about the individual forcefully advocating for their position. They want to make sure that everyone knows exactly where they stand at all times. The next one, expression, ensuring that they can fully articulate themselves and be heard, kind of making sure that they get their point across, that the other person isn't just glossing over what they have to say, but like I said, that they're seen and heard. Reassurance, it's all about making sure that the relationship is okay. This person probably after conflict wants to check in, wants to do whatever they can to make sure both parties are still okay. There's no hurt feelings or hard feelings or anything. Harmony is similar, the next priority in the S category there. And this person is all about trying to make sure that everyone's getting along. Everyone's, we're singing Kumbaya. Again, it's similar to reassurance, and then you want to make sure everyone's together, but it's more focusing on what's best for the overall team in general and not just those two people in conflict. Stability, these individuals want things to be kind of normal. They want the status quo to continue, and conflict is naturally very disruptive, right? It kind of forces you to rethink things about, refocus on what you're thinking about, refocus on how you're executing tasks, things like that. So people that have the stability priority, they kind of just want, okay, let's deal with the conflict and let's get back to normal as quickly as possible. Objectivity, this person wants to make sure, again, the idea makes sense that whatever the argument and conflict is, there's reasoning behind it, there's logic, there's precise information. And they typically don't want to focus on the emotional component of conflict. Justification, this person, one of their priorities is making sure that they can provide support for their view, that they can advocate for their position, and that they can challenge other people's misgivings. If someone disagrees with them, they can challenge it and really justify why they stand there and what their reasoning is. And then finally is the control aspect. And this person in conflict, they want to take charge of the situation. They want to be in control. And it kind of goes back to that focus on winning. So those are the 8 different priorities or values. I went through them relatively quickly. When we actually do this session in November, we spend a lot more time here. And actually in the report, everyone has kind of a personalized narrative that kind of describes how these priorities or values show themselves in your day-to-day life. But one of the things I want to point out, and maybe you've picked up on a little bit, is that some of these priorities or values seem, if not opposites, at least somewhat antithetical to each other in nature. That idea of the D style, the disc person who focuses on control, that kind of flies in the face of, their counterpart with the S style who wants harmony. The C person, they want objectivity. They don't want to deal with emotion. And the I person, they want to make sure that they can express themselves, including their emotion. So that's one of the biggest difficulties, is having conflict with someone with an opposite style of you. If I was a D person and I was having conflict with someone with the I style, we at least share common ground in that we're both kind of assertive individuals. Or if I was in conflict with someone with the C style, I want to engage in, justification. So we can at least share that kind of ground level. But with S, that's a little bit difficult because we don't share any priorities or values in conflict. We don't have any of the similar tendencies. And in fact, our tendencies might be the opposite of one another. So this is really where I think the benefit of the DISC style is understanding where you're at, understanding what might be the benefits there. I'm sure most of you, in looking at your DISC style, you can see why there's a benefit to your style. The C individual, let's calm down, let's take some time to think about this. Let's make sure we're objective. Let's make sure I can justify my position and I can get my point out. Those are all great things, but there's also destructive tendencies to it. With that C style, I may completely avoid the emotional component of conflict, and the emotional component is a real part of it. I might try to focus on going back to the status quo too soon instead of letting conflict play its role, instead of seeing where this leads us and how that might be beneficial. And sometimes I need to back off. I need to state my point instead of keep digging in, keep fighting for it, saying, I've said my piece, now what do other people have to say? So each of these disc styles is equally beneficial in conflict. It brings something unique to the table. There's also some drawbacks to it. That's why we tell people it's super important for you to be able to recognize your style, recognize the situation, who you're in conflict with, and adapt your style. We get people who will say, well, I'm a D, or I'm an I, or I'm an S, or I'm a C. So what do you expect of me? This is who I am. You have to either take me or leave me. And this is not a measure of personality. Personality is something that's relatively stable over your adult life. It's something you can't change no matter how hard you try. But your disc style is absolutely malleable. We like to use the illustration of your disc style is basically a room in your house. Everyone has a room in their house that they're most comfortable with. I know for me, even before quarantine, it was my living room. That's where I spent most of my time. That's where I hung out. That's where I watched TV, played with my dog. Back when my wife used to travel, that's where I ate most of my meals. But now, if I need to do something else, I can go to a different room in my house, right? I'm in my dining room right now in this webinar. If I need to make myself something to eat, I go to the kitchen. If I need to take a nap, I go to the bedroom. It's really about figuring out what the situation calls for, what's most appropriate, and kind of changing your perspective, figuring out what's going to be best, and kind of moving your style that way. It's going to be difficult, and it's more difficult if you're engaging in conflict with someone that you perceive as having a different disc style than you. So that's also why I had you hopefully take a screenshot of that first slide I showed, is that you can diagnose yourself maybe a little bit, but you can also maybe get a little bit of a better understanding of where someone you work with, where their style might be. You might be an S individual when you read through that, and there's one person that you're always having conflict with. And in reading through it, you recognize, well, they're a D style. And it's because you have these kind of priorities or values that are differing from one another and can often be at loggerheads. Now the important thing is trying to figure out, okay, how do I shift my priorities or values? How do I kind of meet them halfway? And now I know you didn't actually ask that out loud, but I'm glad you did, rhetorical person. Because this is the next part. I want you to take a screenshot of this if you can. This is actually one of the last kind of pieces of the puzzle for module 1. Again, I'm only able to spend an 1/8 or a 16th of the time that I really want to dedicate to this. But I think what I provided here, especially with this chart, is going to have the biggest bang for your buck. So this is kind of a handy dandy little cheat sheet that tells you about the different disc styles. It tells you what their goals in conflict are. So what are the things they're really trying to achieve that are really the driving forces for them? That way you can get a little bit of a better understanding of what their disc style might be and what they're really trying to achieve while they're in conflict. Also, you can understand what they tend to overuse. So for instance, the S individual tends to overuse passivity, resistance, and they try to find compromise more than ever, even when this is inappropriate. So if you're engaging in conflict and you can see this either popping up in yourself, these things that are listed under overuse, or you can see a coworker engaging in them, feel free to call them out in kind of a gentle way. I notice you're being a little passive on this. I really want to be able to hear your voice on this. Or for someone with the C style, I think you're being a little bit too analytical about this. You're overanalyzing it. We don't need to overanalyze this. We just need to make a quick decision. And that what I think is really the beneficial thing is those fears. So the fears is what drives people to really dig their heels in conflict. They're afraid of certain things happening. They're afraid of certain situations arising. And these are really the pressure points or the trigger points. And if we can understand our own, we can better understand why we engage in kind of an emotional reaction to conflict, but we can also help meet people where they're at. So if I'm engaging in conflict with someone with the I style and I know their fears are rejection, not being heard, and disapproval, I can make sure that I tailor my approach in conflict to make sure they're not feeling rejected. Saying things like, I completely understand where you're coming from. I appreciate your input. I just want to make sure that we're hearing other perspectives as well so that we can integrate the best approach moving forward. Or if they're not being heard, reciting back what you heard to them and not showing disapproval, just saying, we want to make sure that we have a bunch of different perspectives being shared. So understanding these fears for yourself as well as other people, I think is really going to help you be able to move the needle away from either artificial harmony or the reality TV version of conflict to a more productive response to conflict. So hopefully you were able to take a screenshot of this, save it somewhere on your desktop. And this is the last piece, and this is something that is really a beneficial aspect of the productive conflict tool, and it's something that is carried out through module 1, 2, and 3 is the reflection piece. The way we as humans learn is that we integrate new information into our existing knowledge base, our existing experiences, and that produces new learning. So throughout the entire productive conflict tool, we have these reflection pieces where we ask people to critically think about past experiences they've had. And here you have a sample of what the first reflection is. And I would say, even though you haven't taken the assessment yet, you don't for sure know what your DISC style is, it might be beneficial for you to think critically about these. Think of a conflict situation you were in that you wish you could have handled better, describe it. And what impact do you think your DISC style had on that? Where do you think your priorities or values played a role in that? What do you think you tended to utilize that you overutilized? What was one of the fears that you were trying to avoid? And maybe think about the other person too. What was their DISC style? How did that play a role? What were their priorities or values? Did I meet their fears? Did I accidentally, really step on their fears potentially and cause the situation to get even more out of hand? So I went over that, I know, relatively quickly. Again, when we actually do the modules, the assessment, there's a ton of information. Modules 2 and 3, I think, have a lot of really great information in them because it takes this stuff and really says, all right, with push comes to shove, what does this actually mean for me? What can I do when I'm actually in my workplace and I'm faced with conflict? And I'll just give a sneak preview here a little bit. The Utilize This module was just based on, or this model, which is based on the cognitive behavioral approach that talks about when we're faced with conflict, it's an emotional time. We have these automatic thoughts, these faulty cognitions that pop up, which lead us to take destructive responses. And module 2 and 3 is all about figuring out what our typical destructive responses are and working backwards so we can diagnose our automatic thoughts. And then how do we reframe those to be more effective and engage in a healthier conflict, understanding that we need to adapt our style to meet other people where they're at. So that's all I have. Hopefully you could see that I'm passionate. I'm excited about this information. Hopefully you can utilize some of the information we talked about, and hopefully you'll sign up for the course in November and I will see you there. So next I'll turn it back over to Matthew as I stop sharing my screen.
Yeah, and this is a great time for us to take any questions that you might have as a group. A question that came in already is, when I'm processing conflict and somebody's in quote unquote cancel culture, the person that I'm in conflict with, how do I deal with that?
That's the $1 million question right now, right?
Right, yeah.
Is one of the things that we preach when we do team building, because we do a lot of this, is we preach assume good intent. Is that hopefully for the most part, you've developed relationships with individuals, you know where they're coming from, and hopefully you can explain yourself enough where you can say, I apologize, I maybe utilized a wrong term, I was ignorant on this, and hopefully other people will take the approach that's saying, I recognize there's an emotional component to this, I'm pretty angry about what you said, my knee-jerk reaction is to cancel, but hopefully I can use this as a teaching opportunity. And I would say you need to demonstrate that as well to other people. There are certain situations where you definitely need to cancel people, right? I think we've all seen that recently. Yeah. We've seen that over the past couple of years. But I truly hope that most people are just ignorant on these sort of things and that people will extend grace. And as long as you open yourself up and don't dig your heels in and try to defend yourself or anything like that, just try to take a learning approach. That's kind of the best thing you can do in conflict.
Sure. So another question just came in. I seem to have entered a workplace where the predominant culture is very emotional. The person is pretty clear that they're a type C. I get the idea of adapting style, but I would be doing it constantly. Over time, does it work to be in such a situation?
I can't answer that for them. They need to kind
Yeah.
of do that work. And I feel you. I am a C individual. My wife usually calls me a robot, just because I don't think about the emotional stuff. I don't need it necessarily, so I don't tend to give it. And I think once you start demonstrating a willingness to be able to adapt your style and approach a little bit, and you're talking through why you're doing that, and if you can bring up, like, I think this is one of my priorities or values, I think you're operating from this. And while I think there are some positive tendencies that you have if you're kind of an emotional person, there are some destructive tendencies. So I think, again, you need to demonstrate your willingness to adapt your style, but also have some pretty frank, open conversations with them. Because I think most people will be able to, if they truly think about it, recognize, all right, my style is beneficial some of the time, but certainly not beneficial all of the time. So having those real honest, kind of brutal conversations. And if worse comes to worse, Hicks Carter Hicks were way able to do this with your own team.
Do you think that different cultural backgrounds coming together in workplaces from different countries, et cetera, influence the DISC model?
Oh, absolutely. Like I said, DISC is not personality. We know from personality, the Hexaco model or Neo-PIR, that those are well adapted. Those are pretty universal, regardless of what culture you come from. But your DISC style absolutely is impacted by those backgrounds, those experiences that you have. One example I like to utilize is a friend of mine. He was doing some consulting for a school, and there were kind of 3 Americans on the team and another individual who was from East Asia. And they had grown up in East Asia, they had gotten their PhD in East Asia, but they were working in the US. And this was before quarantine happened, but they were spread out kind of geographically. So they were doing all their calls on Zoom. I think it was Skype at the time before Skype turned into Microsoft Teams. And whenever they would meet together, they all kind of slightly different backgrounds. So they would have these really intense conversations. And this individual from East Asia, his name was Ken. He was an expert in the field, but he was super quiet and super just, didn't really volunteer or say anything during these meetings. But when they divvied up the work, he would go do it, and he would, do an excellent job at it. And as I got to know him a little bit better, the thing that kind of came to light was, based on his cultural background, the family he grew up, even the area of the country he grew up in, his background, he just felt very uncomfortable in that conflict, kind of being very loud, being very vocal, kind of asserting his point of view, especially when he disagreed with the team leader. So based on his style, he was probably a little bit more in that S category, whereas everyone else, from America had no problem kind of chirping at one another, disagreeing with one another. So this definitely plays a role in that. And I think there's some deeper issues as well. This can give you a little bit of an understanding about how you can adapt your approach to interact more effectively with someone from a different background. But it's not a tool to diagnose, say, like, all right, you need to change to meet the rest of us. It's about how can everyone flex their style so that we can meet a little bit more in the middle.
Yeah. Can you talk about an organization that's gone through this training versus an organization that hasn't, and the difference in the productive conflict in each one?
Sure. I laugh because
just a small question, just a small
yeah,
one.
Just an easy one to unpack.
Yeah.
One of my favorite stories is that I was part of a team that was doing this sort of thing, and no one was listening to each other. They were part of a larger organizational culture where you weren't allowed to engage in conflict. Even simply saying, like, I think there's another way to approach it was met with, oh no, this person is a loose cannon. And so it's the same idea of the trash bag, where you can keep stuffing it down, but it's going to explode. And we actually had someone quit in the middle of a session that we were doing, where they said, I can't handle this. No one's willing to flex. No one's willing to adapt their style. I'm just out here on an island. So if you're not willing to engage in productive conflict, if you're saying, my style is my style, you got to deal with it, you're going to have this constant kind of friction with everyone, as opposed to where we've worked with another team where they were a little bit more open, a little bit more willing. It was kind of a bunch of light bulb moments. I know when we were talking, Matthew, the other day, I said one of the most fundamental things we learn as human beings when we're watching Mr. Rogers, when we're watching Sesame Street, is that humans are different from one another. And we kind of know that intellectually, but once we get to the emotional component of conflict, we forget that. We assume everyone has the same perspective, the same understanding, the same ideas in conflict that we do. So by being able to broaden your horizons, recognize I'm not an objective observer in this conflict, I'm not the neutral person, and it's not the other person that's responsible for the issue. If I can open myself up and just start to understand a little bit more about myself, a little bit more about the people I'm working with, everyone will kind of take that burden on of how can I flex my style, adapt it? Because no one really wants to engage in continuous conflict all the time, right?
Right.
So.
Yep. Great. Are there any final thoughts that you want to share with the crowd today?
The only thing I'll say is that I truly love this tool. I think it's a really great tool for helping you understand yourself. And at the end of the day, you get a personalized report. We have a facilitated discussion where I kind of lead it. You get to interact with your classmates who have different styles than you. And we do some activities around this. So it's a really kind of interactive experience that I think creates a lot of kind of aha light bulb moments for people. So that's my plug for my own session.
Awesome. Well, we're excited to have you guys in November. Thank you for today. If you want more information, just visit our website about the Elevate series or any other events we have coming up. And thank you so much. And yeah, if you have any questions, just email me at matthewk@focus-stl.org, and I'll pass them on to Aaron. And that's where we're at today. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you to our sponsors, Citi and Daugherty Business Solutions. And we'll see you all again soon. Have a great day, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.